There's a few limitations to the study, and some of those are, of course, a product of the assumptions, and it should be highlighted. And I'll go through a couple of those here. First of all, we have not been able to quantify the probability of short-range airborne nor thermite transmissions via surfaces, lacking sound empirical evidence. However, in the case of short-range airborne transmission, this has been considered as part of sensitivity testing. The quantification of the risk relies on several assumptions, and these are based on the latest empirical evidence. Another simplification that was put in place was that for simplification reasons, we own for the different probabilities and parameters, we used a mid-value, so we didn't put into place the underlying distribution. And the last point I would like to highlight is the issue of commuters and short distance, and their exclusion from the analysis may show a different risk pattern. However, we have done some preliminary analysis on the short distance travel, and from our perspective, the results seem to be confirmed by the by that analysis. So the risk ranking between car and rail is still favorable towards rail, also in a short distance travel context, but still to be confirmed by further study. Concluding, and based on the analysis and all the factors described during the presentation, first of all, our findings shows that despite a relatively high risk of COVID-19 infection during rail travel in the context of no vaccines, the accident risk for car travel is still higher. In the context with vaccines being rapidly distributed, the overall picture is even clearer. This demonstrates the significant accident risk that continues to persist for car travel, and the results, moreover, are valid for the assumptions stated, such as that passengers wear face masks and that those face masks are highly effective in blocking the virus spread. So this is also about ensuring that onboard train passengers indeed do wear masks, because they can reduce significantly the actual risk. We have done further validation of the risk estimate using sensitivity tests, and those sensitivity tests confirm the robustness of the results. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm now looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you a lot, Torben. We see now how important science is, developing a mathematical model, bringing science into the equation. That can only represent a valid argument to use and trust trains and put railways back in front. Now the floor is open for your questions. Torben and also our other participants can answer questions. You can also ask Joseph Doppelbauer for questions. We already got two, I think, for Torben. I will pick one. The question is, why didn't you apply a real example for this model? Can you answer to this, Torben?
Yes, thanks for the question. I think that is something that could be done in further studies. What we wanted to do was to really here take a European perspective, because of course this is a difficulty in modeling. You have to make assumptions, and that means given that infection risks vary between countries, it would be complicated to make such an exercise. But it's something that we could that could be done in the future. It is certainly also something that other organizations could use the model to test in their particular context. How does it work? So
okay.
What we want Here was a European perspective.
Thank you, Torben. There was another one for clarification. Somebody asks, what is meant by long distance?
Okay. Now, thanks for the question. This is a very good question. There is different definitions concerning long distance in the literature and from statistical authorities, and those definitions are not normally harmonized. Some definitions talk about 80 trips longer than 80 kilometers, and on that basis you can then calculate what proportion of total passenger kilometers are long distance, meaning longer than 80 kilometers. Others would say it's beyond 300 kilometers. What we have done, particularly in the study, is to model a 2-hour journey, and then depending on the speed of travel, we can then comparing the risk. So our core focus was on a 2-hour journey, be it by air, rail, coach, or car.
Okay, I think that one is clear. I have one for our director, maybe. It's a very good one, maybe also for Keir. The question is, what are the main measures, in your opinion, for a fast and healthy post-pandemic recovery for rail? That's a big question. Who wants to answer?
Well, perhaps I go first, but it's a big question, and of course it is a very broad question as well, because there is a huge recovery and resilience fund available. What in my personal view is very important is that this fund is used wisely. And using the funds wisely means that we should at the same time also push the direction of the investment into sustainability. That would mean accelerating some of the measures for rail. And here I am, for instance, thinking of the accelerated ETMS rollout and other measures. So it could be a huge opportunity on the one hand to help the railway sector to recover from the pandemics, but at the same time to accelerate anyhow necessary change of the transport system to more sustainability.
Thank you. So I think we can continue now with Mr. here Fitch. I will not introduce you anymore because I already said it. You're head of unit at DG Move. I give you the floor.
Very many thanks, Torben, and good afternoon, everybody. Well, of course, part of what I was going to speak to in my intervention is precisely what we require for a rapid recovery from the pandemic. But let me first respond to the very interesting work that's just been presented to you in this study. Because I think what it shows is something that, of course, we know very well in many areas, which is that people actually fail to understand risk at all well, and therefore fail to act in ways that are rational from their point of view. So as we've seen, there's been a huge decline in the use of rail. Now, of course, there's been a huge decline at the heart of the pandemic in all transport when people were essentially locked down at home or with only very limited possibilities to travel for essential work, etc. But what you see now, and unfortunately, as Joseph mentioned, if you go out on the streets of Brussels today, you see a very high number of cars. I think perhaps back to more than pre-lockdown, which is clearly reflecting the fact that activity's recovered. People are now out there doing things, but although rail transport, certainly at the local level, I think has recovered somewhat, we still see that in general, rail transport is very suppressed, and suppressed precisely because people still somehow feel that it's not safe. And yet what our study actually shows is that even taking some pretty worst case scenarios, in a sense of assuming very full trains and very non-vaccinated population, actually even on those scenarios, the risk of death by rail is still, because it's so much safer than the road, lower than going by car. So all the people who now think that they are looking after their health by going by car are, of course, doing nothing of the sort. And I think, we need to use this as the starting point for a discussion, because, of course, the reality now is that certainly here in Belgium, half the adult population is vaccinated, and that's going up rapidly. So the levels of the virus are now much lower. And of course, younger people were never we're actually at very low risk of dying from COVID or being seriously ill from COVID, whereas their chance of being injured or killed in a road accident is as high, or actually probably slightly higher than the general population. So for a very large part of the population, what they're doing by going by car is utterly irrational. And I suspect if we reworked the figures, we would probably show that their risk of death now is 10 or 100 times higher by going by car than it would be if they were going by rail, even while there is still some pandemic risk around there. So we have rapidly to get out there a narrative actually that rail is safe, is much safer, and should be used again. And of course, very importantly, and this links to the second part of what I want to say to you, if we don't get climate change right, then the kind of disruption that will inevitably cause to our societies in the end is as great or much greater even than the disruption we've seen from COVID. And yet, if we are simply going back to driving internal combustion engine cars all the time again, then we are not solving those huge problems that we have to face. So it's a very valuable piece of work. Of course, it's quite technical. So in terms of selling it to the outside world, we will need to have some very simple assumptions from it. And the basic one is that even on the worst case, rail was still as safe as road. As we move out of the pandemic, rail is again much safer. But what then else are we doing to drive the recovery from COVID for rail? Because let's be clear, if we are to meet those climate change targets, if we are to recover our economy, rail still has at least as an important part in the transport mix to play as it did in the past, and I hope a much bigger one. And I think there are a number of issues, a number of measures that the Commission, working with our colleagues in ERA and indeed in the research area, are taking with it that we hope will put rail on a fast track to recovery. And firstly, in the very short term, of course, we are taking measures to try and help rail through the worst economic consequences of the pandemic. Now, you'll have seen lots of state aid cases with very large sums of money being offered to airlines. Rail is also eligible for such state aid, and indeed there have been quite a lot of cases of member states coming to the Commission in Brussels seeking authorization for short-term aid for their operators. And I think in pretty much all cases that has been accepted when it's been requested. It's true that there haven't been so many requests for aid, or it's not so much money requested for rail as for aviation, but that's partly also because a lot of rail operations are protected from the immediate economic consequences because they are run as public service obligation. So there is ongoing state support for those, the level of which hasn't been affected by the pandemic. And indeed, in some cases, part of the aid has been to increase the level of PSO support to make up for fare revenue that was no longer there. In addition, though, because of course for the Commission, we are in the process of trying to bring competition into some aspects of rail operation to drive innovation, to drive new services. And of course, unfortunately, it is the new entrants who are not running PSO services, but are trying to run competing services who have been most affected by the pandemic in some ways. And a number of them have unfortunately stopped operating, at least during the pandemic. But to try and protect the whole of the rail operation, we have produced regulation allowing member states to reduce the level of track access charges, so effectively to make it cheaper for train operators to run trains on the network. That's a voluntary measure. Member states don't have to follow it, but a number have made use of it. and the measure was time limited, obviously, but given that the effects of the pandemic are continuing, we will certainly be extending that measure again to try and offer continued support to rail operators over the slightly longer term. But then as we look to the future, and Joseph referred to this already in his last intervention, of course, we have, to aid the recovery of the whole of the European economy post-COVID, we have the Recovery and Resilience Facility, a very, very large programme, €750 million, that was agreed by the European Council as money to be made available to member states to invest in economic activity to stimulate the recovery of the economy post-COVID. But very importantly, it's not a pot of money which member states can just spend on anything they want. It has to be spent targeted in particular on activities to help with a green recovery. So to help with achieving also our climate change objectives, the Fit for 55, i.e. Ensuring that the European economy can manage a 55% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030. Now, this is a bottom-up process. Member states were invited to go away and come up with their own plans, and of course, the situation in member states is very different. The political climate in different member states is different, so they have come up with very different things. But what I think we do see, and the Commission has been challenging them to make sure of this, we do see in very many cases very significant investments requested for rail, some of which indeed is, as Joseph suggested it should, targeted at increasing the rollout of some of the key technical innovations, in particular ERTMS, some of which also, though, is importantly targeted on actually bringing the railway networks of certain member states back into a state of much better performance, addressing backlogs in investment that have occurred in the past. So in future, and these investments are ones that are supposed to take place in quite a short time period, because that is how they boost the economy. In the relatively short term, as a result of these, I would expect that we will see a lot of improvement in the performance of many of the rail systems, much greater reliability. I would imagine in some cases also speed increases, capacity increases, so actually allowing us to do a lot more with rail. Now, as we look to the recovery, I think we will also see different trends in different parts of the rail market. I mean, it's clear post-COVID that there will be a great deal more use made of teleworking in many cities. So I think there is a very big question as to quite what the future of some commuter traffic looks like. And clearly, within cities, I think urban transport is actually recovering pretty rapidly. But perhaps some of the longer distance commuting, we will see people not commuting 5 days a week, but 2 or 3 days a week, and there will be some issues for rail to address there. But as part of the Green Deal, we're also looking for rail to be able to take a much bigger role in some of the long distance or medium to long distance travel across Europe. And here, I think, again, the Commission is taking some very important steps to try and stimulate and help that traffic to recover. I mean, firstly, of course, for the international rail traffic, which has been, like aviation, decimated by the pandemic up to now, we now have the European COVID certificate, which is being rolled out. Some member states have already started using it, and it will be fully deployed across the Union from the 1st of July. So, I mean, that will mean that people who are vaccinated or who have negative PCR tests or have recovered from COVID will be able to use that European recognised certificate to prove their credentials and again start travelling again much more easily. But then finally, there is now a lot of pressure, and indeed the Transport Council, the Transport Ministers meeting this morning, have actually agreed to seek an action plan on passenger rail transport for long distance passenger rail transport. So we will be working again to look at what more we can do to stimulate long distance passenger transport, how we can address some of the continuing obstacles to that. And I hope that the effect of that again will be actually that there is a a much more complete, much more accessible offer of transport on many international routes across Europe, which again will help us rebuild some of that market as people actually get back to travelling around Europe, as we definitely want them to do in the near future. So with that, I'll stop. I mean, I think there's a lot more we could talk about, but I'd be interested very much in your questions and comments. So many thanks, and back to you, Torben.
Thank you so much, Fear. That was really interesting. And I don't know if you did it knowingly or not. You answered already some of the questions from the chat, especially about the future of commuting and long distance travel, etc., etc. That was something that was asked, and you already said that. One question was also about why didn't we compare by traveling by bike, for example. We could have done much more comparisons, of course, but okay, that's what we chose as transport modes, and I guess it's about the distance, right, Torben?
Yes, indeed. I hope.
Yeah. Another question was how speeding rail digitalization could help railways recover, and how the European Commission could boost financial help. That's for Kira, I guess.
Yes, I mean, how digitalization helps, we hope, well, no, it's clear that if it's done properly, digitalization actually should help reduce a lot of the costs of the railway industry, and also to produce extra capacity. Now, this hasn't been entirely the experience of the past, for reasons that we could have another several seminars discussing. But we know that if we get ETCS deployment right, with level 2 deployment or level 3 deployment, and importantly, if we can get rid of a lot of the legacy systems, then we have huge cost savings for the industry, which of course will help. We also know that those modern systems for the future actually can increase capacity a lot. So assuming we not only recover rail demand, but actually make it play the role we want in the future, we will be able to actually absorb that extra traffic and do so in a relatively cost-effective manner, because you may have to build new digital infrastructure, but you don't have to build new physical infrastructure to absorb the capacity. So I think it's a very important way forward. Of course, how we make it happen, well, as I mentioned, we have the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the COVID Recovery Fund, with 750 billion euros, and of course that's not all going to be spent on rail, sadly, but I mean there will be quite a lot of it that goes to rail. So I mean that is financial support that is there now, which is being signed off by the Commission in the next few weeks, I think, and so that will make a difference very quickly. But of course also what we are looking at, and we're doing a lot of work as we look to the future of ETCS, the future development of the Trans-European network, Trans-European transport networks, the TEN-Ts, but also as we look at the work we're now programming for the new European Railway joint undertaking. Part of all of that work is trying to look at much more coordinated pan-European approach to deployment of new innovations. And of course, if we get that right, we make a much stronger business case as well for all of the individual actors in the railway system to invest. So I mean, that should allow them to actually go and get money, in some cases even from private investors, but certainly make a much stronger case to national governments for that investment, as well as the money that the EU can put in. But I mean, our resources are not, I mean, leaving aside the RRF, which really is a large part of money, the actual money we have under things like the Connecting Europe facility are useful, but they're not going to pay for everything. But if we have a good deployment plan, then people can go, as I say, to national governments, to private financiers, to the European Investment Bank as well. And the EIB now has very strong targets to invest in green transport. So it's very interested in supporting European rail investment. But of course, it has got to be clear that those are good, financially viable investments before it can support them. So I hope our work is helping to deliver those strong projects that the bank can then finance. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Keir. In the meantime, we have some more questions coming in. Some of them also concerning the report and the study itself, which will be public. So this will be published on our website. You can find it there. Let me just see if we have more questions related to the current user. Okay, there were more questions about are people going to do more telework and how is that affecting actually the transportation, but you partly answered that here already. Maybe you want to say something into it again, because it's really something, of course, that people are thinking of now after COVID. How will be the future? You just said it now in Brussels, lots of traffic already, and we are not totally recovered yet.
Yeah, I mean, the honest answer is we don't know, and I think also the effect will be very different in different places. I mean, if you look outside the Union to particularly North America or even to the UK, I mean, there you see usage of public transit in cities still hugely depressed, whereas I think in most of the Union there's been quite a strong recovery in certainly the use of public transportation. So, I mean, I think some of it depends very much on this question that we started the afternoon talking about of perception of risk, and clearly in Europe we're not quite so worried about that risk as some people in the States are. But I mean, the real question will be the economic one. Do we end up with a situation where everybody is only ever working from the office 2 days a week again? I mean, if that happens, then clearly in big cities where the whole city economy, let alone the railway, is dependent on large numbers of commuters, I mean, there is going to be huge change, and that will have very severe economic consequences that need to be worked through. But I think, I mean, that may be true for some kinds of commuting, but I mean, people who need to go to school, to college or whatever, or indeed out to shops or the hospital by public transport, I mean, that will continue. A lot of people do jobs that actually they can't telework for. So I think much of the demand will still be there, but we just don't know quite how much. And I think for medium and long distance, I mean, that is driven to some extent by business travel, but also by people who are commuting to see friends, family, or for holiday. And I mean, I think none of that will change. So I think the longer distance market will probably be much less impacted. It's what happens with commuters that we have to wait and see, frankly.
Thank you, Keir. I think I have another question for Joseph here that is interesting, and it is the following. How can we combine the high cost of safety certification homologation processes with the need to make the railway traffic attractive for the operator and increase the freight transport, for example, which is, I think, an issue that Joseph can answer.
Well, first of all, we should qualify what we mean by high cost, because if you compare the cost or the price of a vehicle, the cost of the authorization is a very, very tiny fraction of the overall cost of developing and producing such vehicle. But the true message is that, and it goes back to the subject of today, which is trust in the railway system. And trust depends on the proven safety, and safety also depends on a credible implementation of the processes that make sure from authorization via supervision, also including maintenance. And here at this occasion, I could perhaps advertise our next webinar, which will happen on Monday, the 7th of June, where we'll explicitly speak about maintenance. So I believe it is much more important to have a trust and a proven safety record of the railway system, because it is decisive that rail has the reputation of a safe transport mode, than trying to cut corner in order to save a little bit of money, which in the end will erode the trust that the railways need as a safe means of transport.
Thank you, Josef. I think there's a few more, and one of them is surely also for you. In that we have saving costs in the future with ETCS level 2 or 3 means having to spend a lot of money now refitting the already existing trains and networks. How do you reply to that?
Well, ERTMS has three facets. The first facet is indeed safety, and historically the safety aspect was one of the key drivers for developing ERTMS. The second aspect is actually interoperability. The differences in the signaling systems between the European member states are actually one of the biggest issues in interoperability, and these differences in the signaling system prevent the seamless operation across borders. And these differences in the signaling system already lead to the cost question, because the cost factor now comes from the fact that we have the Class B system that normally, at least until we have a significant degree of deployment, we need double fitment, and the double fitment, at least initially, is leading to higher cost. In the medium term, I believe there should be a situation where we have standard system, and with the new TSI that will come in 2022, we will introduce modularity as well, so that we also contribute to a cost-effective solution. Don't forget that the legacy signaling systems are always only available from a few, and in many cases only from one supplier. So you are locked into the supplier. With ERTMS, we opened the market, and hence in the medium term, and that is certainly the conviction of the Commission and of the agency, we will work in that direction to make ERTMS also an economically attractive proposition.
Thank you very much, Josef. One last question. We have many more, and don't worry, we will answer them later on in the specific place where we publish all the documents. We will also answer your questions. But this one maybe we can go through for Keir. With the rise of remote and flexible working, the topic we already touched today, how much of a priority is the development of digital infrastructure on intercity services to facilitate teleworking everywhere? You're off. Your micro is off. Here.
Sorry, I was double muted.
Yeah, start again.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's very clear that this is a very high priority. I mean, one of the great advantages of rail compared to other modes of transport is that you can sit comfortably and work, or indeed interact with social media or whatever if you want. But that's only going to work if you have the good mobile signal available for you. Now, this is something which the Commission is also trying to support. I mean, there are separate programs supporting 5G rollout in general, and we are looking at making some of the big transport corridors 5G equipped. This is different 5G to the 5G that we're working on for the railway communication system in FRMCS. I mean, there is also a possibility we're looking at to see to what extent there are actually synergies between the future development of the rail telecom system and of the public telecom system that is what passengers need. But it's certainly being worked on. The Commission is trying to support it. There are some other initiatives. I know DB, for example, is busy replacing train windows because the windows they have at the moment actually block some of the mobile frequencies, which obviously is not very helpful for the future either. But I think this is one where you'll see a lot of development really in quite a short period of time. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kia, for answering this. Indeed, very interesting, very complex, going from infrastructure to Windows. We are reaching now the end of this webinar. Before we go, we want to thank you all for participation, for our poll. The results will be aggregated and published on the event page on our website. And for the questions that we could not answer today, we will also publish the answers in the coming days on our event page. And please continue contributing as you did today. We really like to get this feedback from the sector, from our viewers, from all that are interested in these topics. We also look forward to meeting you again in the forthcoming ERA webinars. On the 7th of June, we speak about maintenance of railway vehicles, what's new and what you need to know. And on the 16th of June, the launch of ERA SCS. And the 30th of June, progress on safety towards SARA. And do not hesitate to continue sending us your questions by using the link provided on the events webpage. And we will be happy also to receive any feedback on this webinar, and use the link provided on the webinar webpage, please, for that. I thank you very much for listening, for following us today, and have a good day. See you next time on the 7th of June. Bye-bye.